In 1989, biologists released 714 prairie dogs into a land that many people believed had no hope left. Few could have imagined that creatures weighing less than 1 kilogram would help set in motion the revival of one of the most seriously polluted areas in the United States. Just a few decades earlier, to deal with the massive amount of waste that had accumulated there, the U.S. military had pumped 165 million gallons of chemicals, more than 3.6 kilometers deep beneath the ground in Colorado. Earthquakes occurred, groundwater was threatened, and the entire area gradually became a symbol of an environmental crisis that lasted for decades. How could such a small rodent species help transform a land once considered beyond saving into an ecosystem now showing signs of revival? Join Mandarin Tech as we explore this incredible story. The story began in 1942 when the United States entered World War II. In the middle of the Colorado grasslands, the military built Rocky Mountain Arsenal as a large-scale chemical weapons production center. From the outside, this place may have looked like an isolated military-industrial complex. But inside, it was a true war machine where raw materials were brought in, and the output was terrifyingly destructive weapons. Mustard gas, chlorine gas, Lewisite, napalm incendiary bombs, white phosphorus, and many other types of incendiary ammunition. These were not ordinary weapons. Mustard gas could blister the skin, damage the eyes, and injure the respiratory system. Chlorine gas directly attacked the lungs. Napalm and white phosphorus stuck to their targets and burned violently, turning fire into a weapon that was almost impossible to brush off. When World War II ended, the haunting legacy of Rocky Mountain Arsenal did not stop. Every day, Rocky Mountain Arsenal pushed more waste out of its chemical production lines. At first, it was directed into open ditches, temporary holding pits, and outdoor evaporation ponds. But the amount of toxic waste grew faster than any calculation had expected. Basin F became the largest black spot. Covering an area of 93 acres, this artificial evaporation pond did not contain water in the normal sense. Instead, it held a thick mixture of industrial chemicals, pesticides, and toxic byproducts that had accumulated for decades. Under Colorado's dry sun, the water gradually evaporated, while the toxic substances became more concentrated, settling at the bottom of the pond into heavy layers of black sludge. Then the pollution began to move beyond its boundaries. Chemicals seeped into the soil, slipped through layers of sediment, and entered the groundwater. What had once been trapped inside the holding ponds had now become an invisible stream of danger, quietly spreading beneath the ground. Rocky Mountain Arsenal was no longer just an industrial complex. It had become an environmental bomb-building pressure beneath the Colorado grasslands. And when ordinary control measures were no longer strong enough to contain the disaster, engineers were forced to turn to a much more drastic solution. The strange thing was that even within this land surrounded by chemicals, life had not completely disappeared. The military fences that had once been built to isolate Rocky Mountain Arsenal from the outside world had, by accident, preserved patches of native grassland while the Denver area continued to expand. Behind the cold warning signs, black-tailed prairie dogs still dug burrows beneath the short grass, maintaining small colonies like the last breathing veins of the prairie. By the winter of 1986, when large numbers of bald eagles appeared there, biologists began to realize something. Rocky Mountain Arsenal was not only a land that needed to be cleaned up, it was also a wounded ecosystem, but not a dead one. By the late 1980s, Rocky Mountain Arsenal was no longer a place where action could be delayed. Surveys showed that the toxic substances were not only trapped in old holding ponds, but had become a threat that could continue to spread if they were not stopped in time. A massive cleanup campaign was launched across the site. Excavators, dump trucks, and heavy equipment tore through layers of contaminated soil, opened up old treatment areas, reshaped the terrain, and moved hazardous waste into special landfills. Beneath the ground, contaminated groundwater was pulled through treatment systems, where chemicals were filtered out before the water could return to the natural environment. Each stream of water was controlled as if people were holding a wound closed so it would not keep bleeding. After many years, the most dangerous sources of pollution were gradually isolated. The project cost more than $2.1 billion, but it was also a victory. The toxins had been locked away. The greatest danger had been stopped. Moreover, the discovery of Rocky Mountain Arsenal's ecological value changed the fate of this land. From an area once associated with chemical warfare, it was gradually reshaped into Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge, a national wildlife refuge. But protecting a land does not mean bringing it back to life. Toxins can be isolated, but an ecosystem cannot come back to life through machines and fences alone. It needs a more natural rhythm of breathing. And in 1989, 714 prairie dogs were brought into the restoration areas of Rocky Mountain Arsenal. Some had already been living scattered across this land. Others were rescued from expanding construction sites around Denver, where their colonies were at risk of being flattened by the pace of urbanization. When they were moved to the arsenal, they did not enter an untouched prairie, but a surface that had gone through years of treatment, compaction, and reconstruction. At first, the biologists' goal was very modest: to keep them alive, help them stabilize their territory, and prevent them from disappearing from the restoration area after only the first few seasons. But prairie dogs did not wait for humans to guide them. As soon as they began to adapt, they dug their claws into the hard soil, opened the first burrow entrances, and pulled their living space down beneath the ground. Each small act of digging created openings in the compacted soil. Air began to move deeper, and rainwater seeped in more easily. Layers of soil from below were pushed up to the surface and mixed with the old soil, gradually making the ground less dense and less silent. What machines had once left behind like a hard shell was now being broken apart by the persistent movements of a small animal. They did not know they were taking part in an environmental restoration project. They were only doing what instinct had carved into their bodies: digging, watching, expanding their home, and keeping their colony alive. The first changes did not burst into view immediately. They happened slowly, quietly, almost impossible to notice if one only looked over a few months. But beneath the short grass, the land began to come alive. As the soil became looser and rainwater could seep deeper, the vegetation gradually changed. Native grasses grew more strongly. Nutrient-rich broadleaf plants began to appear, creating a better food source for herbivores. From small movements beneath the ground, the first living layer of the prairie was awakened. The scale of restoration also gradually expanded through each stage. From the initial pollution treatment areas, Rocky Mountain Arsenal was gradually transformed into a refuge covering more than 15,000 acres, equivalent to more than 6,000 hectares. Then the change spread into the sky. Prairie dog colonies created patches of short grass and open ground that many grassland birds needed in order to survive. Among them, the burrowing owl is a special example. They used abandoned burrows underground for shelter, breeding, and raising their young. Their return showed that the underground burrows were no longer only the homes of prairie dogs, but had become the foundation for a wider community of living creatures. When burrowing owls could hold on there, it meant the grassland had enough open space, enough shelter, and enough stability to support new links in the ecosystem. In addition, among the grasses and along the edges of open fields, coyotes also gradually appeared as an important predator link. They did not throw the ecosystem out of balance. On the contrary, their presence showed that the food supply had become abundant enough to support species higher up in the ecological chain. Each link that once seemed broken began to connect again. In 2007, a major milestone appeared when the first herds of bison were brought back to Rocky Mountain Arsenal. For thousands of years, prairie dogs and bison had shaped the grasslands together. One species dug burrows, keeping the ground open and breathable. The other moved in herds, grazed, trampled the ground, and prevented shrubs from taking over open spaces. When bison returned, they did not only add a large mammal species to the refuge, but also restored a natural force that had disappeared from this plain for far too long. Today, Rocky Mountain Arsenal is home to more than 330 species of wildlife and more than 280 species of native plants. Mule deer, bison, coyotes, waterbirds, songbirds, and predators now exist together on a land once considered one of America's pollution black spots. As Rocky Mountain Arsenal began to recover, sylvatic plague quietly swept across the grasslands. The pathogen did not appear as a disaster that was easy to see. Instead, it clung to tiny fleas, spread among prairie dog colonies, and could wipe out an entire underground town in a short time. From 1989 to 2002, the disease broke out many times inside the refuge. In some places, the number of prairie dogs dropped by as much as 95%. When they disappeared, burrows were left empty, birds lost shelter, and predators lost an important food source. The ecological chain that had just been reconnected faced the risk of collapsing once again. Managers were forced to intervene. At first, conservation staff spread flea control dust around each burrow entrance to block the path of infection. This method was effective, but too slow for such a large refuge. Later, scientists developed a bolder solution: peanut butter-flavored bait pellets containing a vaccine against plague, scattered across the grasslands so prairie dogs could eat them on their own and develop immunity naturally. Each bait pellet was also marked with a fluorescent tracer, helping researchers know which individuals had eaten the vaccine. Thanks to this, the disease was pushed back and the entire ecosystem was protected. If there is one measure to know whether Rocky Mountain Arsenal has truly recovered, it must be the black-footed ferret, one of the rarest mammals in North America. Once declared extinct in the wild in 1979, this species was only saved thanks to an accidental discovery in Wyoming 2 years later, when people found the last 18 surviving individuals. All black-footed ferrets today come from that fragile small group. On October 5, 2015, about 30 individuals were released into Rocky Mountain Arsenal. But this was not just a reintroduction. It was the harshest test for the entire ecosystem. Because black-footed ferrets cannot survive if the grassland has not truly started functioning again. They depend almost completely on prairie dogs, hunting them for food, using their burrow systems for shelter, breeding, and raising their young. One adult individual may need 100 to 150 prairie dogs each year. If the prey network collapses, the ferrets will disappear as well. Therefore, their presence does not only show that a rare species has returned. It proves that beneath the grass, the food chain has become strong enough. The prairie dog colonies have become stable enough. And the land once suffocated by chemicals can now sustain a specialized predator. After only 3 years, the number of black-footed ferrets in the refuge increased to about 90 individuals, reaching the recovery goal set by managers. And at that moment, Rocky Mountain Arsenal was not only cleaned up, it had truly come back to life. The power of Rocky Mountain Arsenal does not lie in one miraculous moment, but in a chain reaction that lasted for decades. From the 714 prairie dogs released in 1989, small burrow systems opened up the hardened soil, creating paths for rainwater to seep deeper, bringing back microorganisms and living processes that had been interrupted for far too long. As the soil recovered, the vegetation also changed. Native grasses gained more chances to take root, nutrient-rich plants appeared more often, and then insects, grassland birds, and predators returned one after another. Bald eagles found a food source. Bison were brought back to help keep the rhythm of the vast grassland. And finally, the black-footed ferret appeared as proof that the food chain had become strong enough to support a predator species that had once almost disappeared from the wild. From one small link beneath the ground, the entire ecosystem began to be assembled again. The result today is not only seen in the return of wildlife, but also in the way a land that had once been sealed off gradually opened up to the community. Areas once associated with waste, warning signs, and security fences have now become spaces for observing nature, environmental education, and ecological research. Each year, the refuge welcomes more than 340,000 visitors, with about 20 miles of walking and biking trails and an 11-mile wildlife drive. The cleanup process also left behind enormous numbers. Nearly 16,000 acres have been removed by the EPA from the Superfund list, marking a major shift from polluted land to a safer space for the community and nature. Part of the land that once belonged to the project area was also transferred to Commerce City to develop schools, a civic center, a stadium, and public parks. But Rocky Mountain Arsenal is not a story painted in perfect colors. There are still 725 acres behind fences where hazardous waste has been concentrated, buried, and must continue to be monitored over the long term. That detail is exactly what makes the recovery here feel more real. Nature did not erase the past completely. Instead, humans learned how to lock away the rest. Rocky Mountain Arsenal was once a place where humans turned the grasslands into a storage ground for war, chemicals, and mistakes that lasted for decades. But on that very land, which seemed to have been lost, life still found a way to return. No miracle happened overnight. There was only a long and persistent cleanup process. Layers of toxic substances locked away. Grasslands given a chance to recover, and then nature began to reconnect what had once been broken. Prairie dogs dug the first burrow systems. Birds of prey returned to the sky. Bison walked across the grasslands. The black-footed ferret appeared as the final sign that the prairie had truly come back to life. If you found this story interesting, please like and subscribe to Mandarin Tech to continue exploring other incredible journeys.